Rebirth of a Nation, written and spoken by Father Leonard Coughlan, OFM Capuchin, was released to coincide with the 1996 movie Michael Collins. In this recording, Father Leonard gives a completely fresh insight into the spirituality and character of the 1916 leaders, qualities he considers of paramount importance to the search for peace in our time.
Film of Michael Collins, which was released for viewing in 1996, raised in my mind many thoughts about the life and death of the different leaders of the 1916 Rising. Looking back over the years, I believe the death of those men was the rebirth of our country. There were people of great vision and great dignity. As the 1916 Rising and the Civil War were close together, just a few years between them, it is quite understandable that many of the same men, and indeed women as well, would be involved in both. Michael Collins was one of those men. He was staff captain in the General Post Office in 1916 and aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett. He did not figure very prominently in the Rising, but he was one of the most outstanding leaders in the War of Independence. He was Director of Intelligence and ultimately Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Free State Army. Collins, in appearance, was tall and burly, athletic. He spoke with a countrified brogue. He was born in Sam's Cross, near Clonakilty, near my own hometown Macroom in County Cork. And the character of Collins was one which almost defies analysis. It is said he had the instinct of a visionary, the calculating watchfulness of the strategist, and the ability to organize. The observation that Collins was forever wanting to get things done, wanting to get on with things, that description fits in well with the restless temperament of a man who had the idea that sleep was a waste of valuable time. In death, he was like a marble figure dressed in uniform, lying in state in Dublin City Hall, covered by the Free State flag, with a crucifix on his breast. The untimely death of Michael Collins was a hard blow to Ireland, but more about that on a personal note later. For the present, I'll concentrate on the 1916 men who were executed. Things may not be in proper sequence, and there may be a certain amount of repetition and some omissions, but as I am now in my 83rd year, I am sure allowances will be made. In 1966, we had some very good programs on Telefishéireann, the Irish National Television Service, about the Rising. But the deeply spiritual character of the executed men was, for some reason, totally overlooked. So at that time, I felt obliged to rectify things. First of all, let us take Padraig Pearse. On Tuesday, the 2nd of May, 1916, a military car came to the Friary in Church Street, Dublin, of course, with a letter for Father Aloysius. It read, "The prisoner P.H. Pearse desires to see you, and you have permission to visit him. Failing you, he will be pleased to see any of the Capuchins. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Major W.S. Klinsmann." Accompanied by Father Augustine, Father Aloysius went to Kilmainham jail. He was told there that Thomas MacDonagh wanted to see him as well. Aloysius said he would never forget the devotion with which Pearse and MacDonagh received the Blessed Eucharist. He told Pearse that he had attended James Connolly in Dublin Castle that morning, and Pearse said, "Thank God, it was the one thing I was anxious about." Father Aloysius told me that at some time during the night, he left Pearse's cell, and on his return, he looked through the peephole of the door. A ray of light was shining through, and inside, Pearse was silhouetted, lost in prayer, clasping a large mission cross that Father Aloysius had taken with him. It was a memory that Aloysius always treasured. As a memento, Pearse scratched the first letter of his name with a pin on the back of the cross. I later gave that cross to the museum in Kilmainham. The two priests stayed with the prisoners until about 3 in the morning. They were then ordered to leave. They were not allowed to stay for the actual executions. Next day, they protested, and from then on, priests were allowed to be present at the executions. Perhaps at this point, I should speak about James Connolly, because he was a socialist and Labour reformer. Connolly has always been the subject of much controversy. But Connolly was a man of faith as well as a man of great principle. I quote Father Aloysius about what happened when he went to see Connolly in Dublin Castle on May the 1st. The soldiers left the room, and I was alone with Connolly. I told him I had given my word I would act only as a priest, and not in any political capacity. "I know that, Father," he said. "You would not get the privilege of being alone with me otherwise, and it is as a priest I want to see you. I have seen and heard of the brave conduct of the priests and nuns during the week, and I believe they are the best friends of the workers." I heard Connolly's confession. Captain Stanley, who was in charge, showed himself a Christian and humane man, and Connolly spoke to me of his great kindness to him though Stanley was politically and in religion at variance with the prisoners. Some of the officers paid tribute to the volunteers, one of them remarking that they were the cleanest and bravest lot of boys that he had ever met. 8 or 9 days later, on the 12th of May, when Connolly was to be executed, Father Aloysius was again called to Dublin Castle, and he gave Connolly Holy Communion. Now, in 1966, I saw a television program which showed James Connolly being put into an ambulance and taken on his own to Kilmainham jail for execution. It was a sad and touching program, good television, but historically untrue. Fathers Aloysius and Sebastian went with him in the ambulance, stayed with him, and Aloysius stood beside the firing party when Connolly was shot. Father McCarthy from James Street was there to administer the last rites of the church. And when the Capuchins returned to Church Street, then, as always, they celebrated Mass for the repose of the soul of the executed men, if not immediately, very soon after. On the night of the 3rd, word again came to Church Street to attend the execution of Joseph Plunkett, Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan, and Willie Pierce. All 4 received Holy Communion. Fathers Albert, Augustine, Sebastian, and Columbus prepared them for death. No need to stress the religious conviction and fidelity of those men. 'Twas Plunkett wrote that lovely poem, referring of course to Christ. I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars the glory of his eyes. His body gleams amid eternal snows, his tears fall from the skies. I see his face in every flower, the thunder and the singing of the birds are but his voice, and carven by his power, rocks are his written words. All pathways by his feet are worn, his strong heart stirs the ever-beating sea. His crown of thorns is twined with every thorn, his cross is every tree. Joseph Mary Plunkett. It was said that Sean McDiarmid was estranged from the church because of some difference he had with a priest. He was not the first man who had a difference with a priest, and as a consequence was estranged from the church. But I'll quote Sean McDiarmid's last letter to his brothers and sisters, and people can then judge for themselves. He writes, by the time this reaches you, I will, with God's mercy, have joined in heaven my father and mother, as well as my dear friends who have been shot during the week. I have priests with me almost constantly for the past 24 hours. One dear old friend of mine, Dr. Brown of Maynooth, stayed with me till a very late hour last night. I feel a happiness, the like of which I have never experienced in my life before. And at the end of the letter he says, God bless and guard you all, and may he have mercy on my soul. A letter beautiful in its simplicity and marvelous in faith and hope and trust. I should have also quoted another little piece from Sean's letter, which shows the thoughtful and practical side of the man. He said, "By the way, when you are in Dublin, find out if I owe any money to my landlady, and if so, pay her. I don't think I do, but at the moment I'm not certain." And apparently there was a romantic side to his life as well, because he says, "If I think of any other things to say, I will tell them to Miss Ryan. In all probability, had I lived, she would have been my wife." Tom Clark was one of the senior men in the Easter Rising. He was attended to spiritually by Father Columbus, while Major Sean McBride was assisted by one of the Capuchin priests already mentioned. I just forget his name. Sean was also one of the senior men of the volunteers. He was a Mayo man, Westport, and as a young man went to South Africa, formed the Irish Brigade, and fought with the Boers against the English. So Clark and McBride were what one might call seasoned warriors. Clark had been in the Fenian movement. But moving along to Con Colbert, there was a story told about Colbert which said that he died joking with the men who were preparing him for death. Con was not a man to joke at such a solemn time. In the words of Father Augustine, Colbert was far too reverent a person to joke with anyone on such a solemn occasion. He was a quiet type of young man. It was he who on the previous Good Friday would only take a finger of bread and a cup of black tea at the home of a friend, a little penance in memory of the sufferings of Christ. He walked arm in arm with Father Augustine across the jail yard to his execution. Houston, Sean Houston, another young volunteer. I'll quote an excerpt from a letter written by Father Albert about Houston. At 1:30 a.m. on May the 8th, a military car came to Church Street for us. We went to Kilmainham. Father Augustine went to Eamon Cancel. I to Commandant Mellons. I did not remain long, as he was on his knees in prayer. Having visited Con Colbert and Eamon Cant, I went to Sean Houston's cell at about 3:20. He was kneeling beside a small table with the rosary beads in his hand. He wore his overcoat, as the morning was extremely cold. During the last quarter of an hour, he knelt in that cell in complete darkness, as the little piece of candle had burned out. He had been to confession and had received Holy Communion early that morning, and was not afraid to die. I told him that I would anoint him when he was shot. We now proceeded to the yard where the execution was to take place. My left arm was linked in his right. A soldier directed Sean and myself to a corner of the yard, a short distance from the outer wall of the prison. Here there was a box, seemingly a soap box, and Sean was told to sit down on it. He was perfectly calm and said to me for the last time, "My Jesus, mercy." I had scarcely moved a few yards away when a volley went off, and this noble soldier of Irish freedom fell dead. Mellon, Michael Mellon, Commandant Michael Mellon, a most lovable character. At 2:30 on the morning of the 8th of May, an army lorry called to take Mrs. Mellon to Kilmainham. She had to take the children with her because she had nobody to mind them. While the mother was in the cell with Michael, the children were left sitting in a waiting room. Una was then a little girl of 6, and the guard came over to her, put his arms around her, and said, "You poor little thing." Una later became a nun in Spain, I think, and her 2 brothers became Jesuits. Going back for a moment to the execution of Sean Houston, I was surprised at Father Albert putting things so bluntly when he said, "I will anoint you when you are shot." Would it not have been better if he had said, "I will anoint you later"? Yet Albert was a sensitive, kind, and thoughtful person, one of the best. And once again, I will digress to a totally different point. I have spoken a lot about Aloysius and his work for the 1916 leaders. Well, it was that same priest who 40 years later assisted Jim Larkin when he was dying. Aloysius told me afterwards the last thing Jim did before he went to God was to clasp his hand, thank him for all he had done, and tears of happiness and joy rolled down the cheeks of big Jim Larkin. One thing that strikes me about those dreadful days of 1916 is the tremendous respect the British soldiers had for the volunteers, and, on the other hand, the way the prisoners spoke about the kindness shown them by the soldiers. When Count Colbert was being led out to execution, the soldier who was to bind his arms before he faced the firing squad grasped his right hand and shook it warmly with affection and tears. Or, as Father Augustine put it in his own inimitable way, a warm-hearted soldier pinioned Khan's arms gently. May 1916 was a terrible month, and yet there was a certain dignity and nobility and idealism in the whole conflict. These qualities are no longer to be found in modern society. They are replaced by self-interest and greed, not to speak of bitterness and violence. People sometimes say to me, "You must have seen big changes down the years." Yes, I have. And I often wonder if the men of 1916 could only have foreseen the Ireland of today. Yes, and the Ireland of the Civil War, would they have been so proud to give their lives for their country? There is no doubt that we have become a richer nation, but man does not live on bread alone. Many of our troubles started with the brutality of the Civil War. I was too young then to remember very much about it, though I do remember seeing Michael Collins a short time before he was shot. He was walking from a car to an hotel in the town of Macroom, and I remember seeing a very poor-looking woman give him a bunch of flowers. Shortly after that, Collins was shot in Bien-le-Blas. Bien-le-Blas, the gap of the blossoms. Many things happened during the Civil War, but I believe people are even more afraid of what is happening today, north and south. And what of the future? It's hard to say. But there is one thing for sure. We cannot build a just and peaceful society if we ignore proper standards, moral standards. But to the heroes of 1916, I say, Oniania dia trochere erbunan.
End of side A. Please fast forward to finish this side and turn tape over.
In part 1, I have spoken in some detail about the executions of the volunteers in 1916. But there are also other aspects of the lives of these men which are of great interest and great importance. Many of them were men of letters, poets, and writers, and avid readers as well. The writings of the renowned mystics like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and the great scholastic philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas formed a great part of the everyday reading of Joseph Mary Plunkett. His poems, often deeply religious, are of superb lyrical quality. And it's interesting to know that St. Oliver Plunkett, martyred in the 17th century, was of the same family. Plunkett spent a little while studying at Stonyhurst in England, and quite a while too in Belvedere College in his native Dublin. He took his degree at UCD. His poems are usually direct and simple, easy to understand, like that one, "The stars sang in God's garden." The stars sang in God's garden. The stars are the birds of God. The nighttime is God's harvest. Its fruit are the words of God. God plowed his fields at morning. God sowed his seed at noon. God reaped and gathered in his corn with the rising of the moon. The sun rose up at midnight. The sun rose red as blood. It showed the reaper, the dead Christ, upon his cross of wood. For many live that one may die, and one must die that many live. The stars are silent in the sky, lest my poor songs be fugitive. On the morning of his execution, in the presence of the prison chaplain, with the light of one candle, and with one water as witness, Plunkett married Grace Gifford, the woman who loved him. He is buried in the Patriots' Plot in Arbor Hill, Dublin. Pearse, Commandant General of the Irish Republican Army, was born in Dublin in 1879 of an English father who was a sculptor and an Irish mother. From his father, he inherited an artistic temperament, and from his mother, an intensive love for Ireland and its history and its people. The Christian Brothers gave him his early education in Westland Row School, and he took his degrees in Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Law from the old Royal University. He became a member of the IRB and was also a member of the military council that organized the Rising. One of the greatest events of his career was his oration in 1915 at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa in Glasnevin Cemetery. It was a rousing speech, and yet I believe if Pearse lived in the Ireland of today, he'd work through political channels rather than through army or military confrontation. You know, the people want peace. His speech at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa set the blood of Irishmen coursing through their veins. And yet, ironically, it was Pearse who was later burdened with making the decision to surrender. he was in supreme command of Ireland's military forces. At his court-martial, he offered his own life and begged the judges that they would allow him, as Commander-in-Chief, to bear the whole responsibility. This was not to be. He was shot in Kilmainham jail on May the 3rd, 1916, and was buried in Arbor Hill. His body and the bodies of his comrades are now in an honoured plot, beautifully maintained in the historical Arbor Hill Cemetery. In his poem, I Am Ireland, he wrote, I am Ireland, I am older than the old woman of Beara. Great my glory, I that bore Coughlan the valiant. Great my shame, my own children that sold their mother. I am Ireland, I am lonelier than the old woman of Beara. Thomas McDonough was born in Cloughjordan, County Tipperary, and from his father he inherited a love of Ireland and her rich traditions. He went to Rockwell College with the intention of becoming a priest, but discovered he had not got a vocation. He then turned to teaching. It was in the Aran Islands that McDonough first met Pearse, and the serious-minded Pearse found McDonough a pleasant companion, full of wit and gaiety. But McDonough's poems are not always that easy to understand, for me at any rate. He loved people to be around him. He loved to talk. In 1912, he married Muriel Gifford, whose sister, Grace, later married Joseph Plunkett in Kilmainham jail. McDonough went to teach in St. Enda's. That, of course, was Pearse's school. And when St. Enda's was moved from Cullen's Wood House to Rathfarnham, McDonough came to live in a gate lodge nearby, and his house became a centre for the well-known writers of his day. He loved music. He loved life. He wrote some well-known books, and he also wrote a play which was presented at the Abbey Theatre in 1907. The name of the play was When the Dawn is Come. He shares the same plot in Arbor Hill as the other signatories of the proclamation. Sean MacDiarmid. Sean was born in Kiltyclogher, Leitrim, in 1884. He left home early in life and went to Glasgow and served his time as a barman. I suppose at that time there was nothing in Kiltyclogher for him. He returned to Belfast, where he worked as a tram driver. It was in Belfast that he came in touch with the Irish movement for freedom. In the early 1900s, he came to Dublin and became a close friend of Tom Clark. Clark saw his potential as an organizer. Clark was a shrewd man. From 1907 to 1912, MacDiarmid spent his time going right through the country, addressing meetings and setting up clubs to promote Irish freedom. During that time, too, he ran the journal Irish Freedom. He worked from an office in Delia Street, Dublin. His excessive work in all weathers took toll of his health. And in 1912, he contracted polio. He spent many weeks in hospital, and illness left him with a badly damaged leg. But his illness and his lameness did not dampen his enthusiasm, and he continued his sterling work as an organizer, now concentrating principally on founding units of the Irish Volunteers. After an anti-conscription speech at a meeting in Galway in 1915, he was arrested and charged with giving a seditious speech. He was condemned to 4 months' hard labour, which he served in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin. He was an ardent advocate of the Rising and fought in the GPO, the General Post Office, during Easter week. It later fell to him to read Pearse's letter of surrender. It must have been a hard thing for MacDiarmid to do, to surrender. He was court-martialed and found guilty. He was shot in Kilmainham Jail on May the 12th. His body lies with his comrades in Arbor Hill Cemetery. One could not speak of 1916 without including the Countess Markievicz, Constance Gore-Booth. She was president of Cumann, and of course she lived in Lissadale, County Sligo. She was second in command to Commandant Michael Mallon in the St. Stephen's Green area of Dublin. She was sentenced to death on Saturday the 6th of May, but the sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. She was taken to a women's convict prison in England, but was released in a general amnesty in 1917. She died in 1927. They say the 1916 Rising never really took off in Munster because of breakdown in proper communications. But there were happenings there and people there whose names will go down in Irish history. One could not think of the Easter Rising without thinking of the Kent brothers. The defence of their home in Castlelyons, County Cork, is a story of bravery and courage. The RIC, backed up by the army, came to Castlelyons to arrest them. They held out until they were finally overwhelmed by bigger numbers and better arms. During the fight, David was wounded but recovered. Richard was shot while trying to escape and later died of his wounds. Thomas was court-martialed at Cork Detention Prison and sentenced to death. He was shot in that same prison on May the 9th. William was court-martialed at Richmond Barracks in Dublin and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to penal servitude, and he was deported to an English jail, but was released at the end of 1916. The bravery of the Kent brothers will be long remembered. Kent. Eamon Kent commanded the 4th Dublin Battalion of the Volunteers, the men who took over the South Dublin Union and fought a gallant defence against a vastly superior force. He was born in Ballymore, County Galway, but practically all his life was spent in Dublin. He had his education at O'Connell Schools, North Richmond Street, and he worked as a clerk in the City Treasury Department of Dublin Corporation. In temperament, he was a quiet man, distant, remote, and even his fellow workers knew little about him. He was one of the signatories of the proclamation. He always spoke his native language and was a great lover of music. During Easter week, he fought in the South Dublin Union until the order to surrender was brought to him. I read an eyewitness's account of his surrender. It said, "On the day of his surrender, I saw him lead his men to the place where they were to lay down their arms. His bearing was noble, magnificent. I felt proud of him in my heart, and the British soldiers looked on in wonder." And he continues, "Someday I hope to tell you much that is inspiring of his last moments and his glorious death with my own crucifix in his hands." And on a personal note, I have a copy of the letter Kent wrote the night before he was executed. It's a long letter, so I will not repeat all of this, just a little bit. He says, "I bear no ill will towards those against whom I have fought. I have found the soldiers and the higher officers human and sociable. I have met the man who escaped from me by a trick under the Red Cross. I do not regret having withheld my fire. He gave me cakes. Kant's grave is also in Arbor Hill. Eamon de Valera. The name de Valera has been associated with Irish politics down through the years. As we already know, Michael Collins was involved in the 1916 Rising, in the War of Independence, and in the Civil War. So also was Eamon de Valera. He was in all three as well. It is regrettable and sad to see two men of such great idealism starting out together in 1916 and a few years later ending up on opposite sides in the Civil War. You know, it's a strange thing that I can speak of the 1916 Rising with a certain amount of pride, yes, and even joy. But I feel ill at ease when speaking of the Civil War. Ashamed, just as I feel ashamed of many things that are happening today. Eamon de Valera was born in New York, but spent most of his earlier life in Brewery, County Limerick. Like many of his comrades in the Easter Rising, he was an intellectual, a great mathematician. During the Rising, he was commanding officer in Boland's Mills. With his 1916 comrades, he was tried and condemned to death. People may ask, what does it matter where one is born or where one dies? To Eamon de Valera, it mattered quite a lot where he was born. It meant the difference between life and death. Had he not been an American citizen, he too would, in all probability, have been executed in the yard of Kilmainham jail. But fate decided otherwise. He was left to play a big part in Irish politics after the rebirth of our country. And now, I think I have covered all the men of the proclamation. Thomas Clark, Sean McDermott, P.H. Pearce, James Connolly, Thomas McDonough, Eamon Kent, and Joseph Mary Plunkett. The Easter Rising brought much pain and suffering to the hearts of the Irish people. But it had its moments of glory as well. I believe the following years were far more painful. The years of the Civil War, when Irishmen fought against Irishmen, and brother fought against brother. when great men like Michael Collins were shot down, and young soldiers, Republican and staters, as we used to call them, when they were blown sky high by bombs that were planted by their own Irishmen. A comparatively new word has now found its way into the language of civil leaders and politicians. The word dialogue, a method by which differences can be ironed out without war and without violence. Would that be too much to hope for at the end of the 20th century? Well, who knows? But 1916 may well be looked upon as the rebirth of a nation. Anish, Slán, agus Banach, Achad.